I saw Dave at a conference a couple of years ago, and he told me that he was working on this translation. I was very excited, so I'd just like to thank him for his work and congratulate him on his magnificent achievement. So thank you very much, Dave. I first met Professor Ulrich in 1993 when I was a student at the Casa Balthasar in Rome. And over the years, he was an important guide to me spiritually and intellectually. Intellectually, he inspired me to read St. Thomas and Heidegger, and I've been doing it ever since. They are at the center of my work, Thomas as the master and Heidegger as an important interlocutor. So I was very grateful and glad to be invited to give a paper at the symposium, which I was able to bring all three together in dialogue. I've changed, so the official title that's on the program is still more or less what I'm going to be talking about, but I've given a new title to my paper. The new title is Heidegger, Ulrich, Thomistic Metaphysics and a Tale of Two Onto-theologies. So this paper that I'm going to present now is a summarized and chopped up version of the original. When I got to about 12,000 words in that original version, I realized that I had to do something different, right? So I did a lot of chopping and summarizing, and hopefully it still makes sense. We'll see. You can let me know. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay. Martin Heidegger would surely be perplexed by Ferdinand Ulrich, a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas, positioning himself as a critic of ontotheology. It is true that Heidegger never goes through the formality of officially charging Thomas with ontotheology, as he does with, say, Hegel, but that is of no real consequence. In Heidegger's view, Thomas, along with every other Western thinker, from the ancient Greeks down to Husserl, belongs to the super epoch of the Seinsgeschichte, or history of being, that Heidegger calls metaphysics. Ontotheology for Heidegger is just the name of the specific figure that all metaphysics assumes. So he would presumably insist that a Thomist like Ulrich could only be a critic of ontotheology by some existential contradiction, by rejection of his own essential identity. Before we can relate Heidegger's critique of ontotheology to Thomistic metaphysics, however, we first need to understand the ontology that underwrites it and compare it to the Thomistic ontology espoused by Ulrich. We shall discover that behind Heidegger's critique of ontotheology is a phenomenological ontology that is altogether different from Ulrich's existential Thomistic ontology. Ulrich would tell us that Heidegger's ontology, regardless of its pretensions to the contrary, can only bring us to what is at best penultimate, leaving the deepest ground of things, God is ipsum esse subsistens, in the dark. It is the latter, infinitely more than Heideggerian Sein, that deserves to be called the Abgrund, Ab-Grund, sometimes translated as the abyssal ground of things, and for that reason also the göttliche Gott, the divine God. The existential ontology of Thomistic metaphysics opens a path to this God beyond Sein. It should be noted that Heidegger's formulation of ontotheology and Ulrich's, though similar, aren't quite the same. To signal this difference, I shall refer to Heidegger's formulation of ontotheology as ontotheology A and to Ulrich's as ontotheology B. We shall see that Heidegger's critique of ontotheology A, has no force against Thomistic metaphysics rightly understood. As for Ulrich's critique of ontotheology B, he himself shows us that it doesn't touch Thomistic metaphysics. I shall begin my paper with an overview of Heidegger's later thought, his account of ontotheology, and his reasons for rejecting it. From there, I shall move on to show, with Ulrich's help, why the existential ontology of Thomistic metaphysics exceeds Heidegger's phenomenological ontology in important respects, and ultimately leads us beyond Sein to God as ipsum esse subsistens. Next, I shall consider how Thomistic metaphysics relates to ontotheologies A and B. Then finally, by way of conclusion, I shall, well, actually I had to cut the conclusion, so just not going to do that one. First part, the later Heidegger and ontotheology. As we know, Heidegger was not the first to use the term ontotheology. That distinction seems to belong to Immanuel Kant. For Kant, ontotheology is the name for the view according to which, this is a quote from Kant, God's existence can be cognized by mere concepts without any help from experience. In ontotheology, three concepts of God are basic. God is ens originarium, ens summum, and ens entium. That's Kant. Heidegger's account of ontotheology may owe something to Kant's, but I am not going to explore that relationship between the two here, except to say that Heidegger's account is much less straightforward. As I have noted in another place, there is no consensus among Heidegger's interpreters about what he means by ontotheology. Nevertheless, I think everyone would agree that if we're even going to get close to getting it right, we need to have some general understanding of Heidegger's post-being and time thought. The term ontotheology does not enter into Heidegger's vocabulary until the 1930s. Being in time is in 1927. Even if the key moves and ideas in his critique of ontotheology have obvious precedence in his earlier thought. To begin my overview of Heidegger's later thought, I shall start with Heidegger's notion of Sein, or being. The meaning of being in Heidegger is, of course, another questione disputata among his interpreters. The word that Heidegger often uses for human beings or for our special capacity to be open to being is Dasein. There are good reasons to think that for the Heidegger of the being in time period, being is just how we, Dasein, understand beings. That is, the meaning or intelligibility that they have for us. And because how we understand beings seems, according to the Heidegger of this period, to be determined by how they fit into the context of our personal interests, their being can change from person to person and even multiple times for the same person. To explain this point, Thomas Sheehan invites us to imagine a camping trip on which we have forgotten to bring a hammer. Hammers are very famous for, in Heidegger's work, especially being in time. In the absence of a hammer, this is Sheehan, in the absence of a hammer at my campsite, he says, I use this rock to pound in tent pegs. This piece of granite is currently a mallet. But once I find my hammer, the rock will cease to be a mallet, and I may take it instead as a paperweight or as a weapon or as something useless. End quote. Hence, in just a few minutes, this hard gray mass will have gone through 3 or 4 different beings. The Heidegger of being in time sees being as closely connected to but distinct from truth understood as aletheia, which he regards as the manifestation of beings. The connection between being and aletheic truth during this early period is summed up correctly, I believe, by Fredrik Olofsson, who says that entities must show themselves is a necessary condition for our understanding them in any particular way. In other words, and to return to Sheehan's example, I may take something to be a mallet or a paperweight or a weapon, but unless it manifests itself to me, I won't take it to be anything at all. Heidegger is always insistent that being is itself not a being. That is what he calls a Seiendes. Heidegger uses the adjective ontological, ontologisch, for whatever has to do with being, and ontisch, for whatever has to do with beings. And he refers to the difference between being and beings as the ontological difference, ontologische Differenz. In being and time, beings appear to be capable of existing independently of Dasein, and so also of being itself, insofar as being is just the meaning that beings have for us. So, in a famous passage, Heidegger explains that, quote, beings are, quite independently of the experience by which they are disclosed, the acquaintance in which they are discovered, and the grasping in which their nature is ascertained. But being is only in the understanding of those beings, i.e. Dasein, to whose being something like an understanding of being belongs, end quote. From this text, the Heidegger of being in time can plausibly be construed as a realist about beings, but a constructivist about being, or to incorporate his own language, he can be construed on the one hand as an ontic realist, and on the other hand as an ontological constructivist. Not only does Heidegger hold that being as meaning depends on Dasein, so too does aletheic truth. This truth, he writes, is only insofar as and as long as Dasein is. The reason for alethetic truth's dependence on Dasein is not hard to figure out. If truth in this sense is the manifestation of beings, then without something to which the manifestation is addressed, without what Thomas Prüfer would call the dative of manifestation, there would be no manifestation. Put differently, manifestation is relative to the intending of the manifestation, the addressees taking it in. No Dasein, no manifestation. Heidegger tells us that his ontology in being and time, his account of being, is phenomenological, since it focuses on what manifests itself to us, phenomena. Although it probably goes without saying, we could add for the sake of precision that it focuses on what manifests itself to us as meaningful. But as John Deely observes, behind Heidegger's phenomenological ontology in being and time, there is a second ontology that remains unthematized, or at least undeveloped. This shadow ontology emerges momentarily into the light, for instance, when Heidegger says that beings are independent of Dasein. What are his reasons for making this claim, and how are we to understand the being that permits this independence to beings? These questions go unanswered in Being and Time. Against those interpreters who think that Heidegger's understanding of being remained pretty much steady throughout his career, I would contend that there is an evident change after Being and Time. We see in a lecture course entitled Introduction to Metaphysics, which was summer of 1935, which was later published as a book in 1953, Heidegger has ceased to think of being as the meaning of beings, and now begins to identify it with the manifestation of beings, that is, with aletheia. Now I'm going to have to do some extreme summarizing, and I have for you a series of bullet points. They're kind of substantial bullet points. First bullet point, I'm not going to tell you first, second, third, but this is the first bullet point.
Just tell us.
In Heidegger's later thought, being becomes the event itself of manifestation, of the manifestation of beings to Dasein. He reduces beings to phenomena, that is, what gets manifested in the event or events of manifestation, that is being itself. Thus, the shadow ontology of being and time is eliminated, and beings only are in a kind of state of suspension between being and Dasein. Being has a priority, however, because, as Heidegger says in the letter on humanism, we don't determine how beings are manifested to us. That is, we don't determine the phenomena. So Heidegger's ontology remains a phenomenological one. But being's new priority over Dasein suggests that the later Heidegger is no longer the ontological constructivist of being and time. However, if he is an ontological realist, his realism about being eludes straightforward taxonomies of realism. Is he still an ontic realist? Perhaps he still is secundum quid. One is half tempted to compare the later Heidegger to Bishop Berkeley. But with Heidegger, it's not God who's projecting a world into our minds, it's being. He tells us that beings are manifested in different ways in different historical periods. This is the Seinsgeschichte, or history of being. The different ways that beings are manifested, Heidegger calls epochs. Although the manifestation of beings assumes different figures across the various epochs of the Seinsgeschichte, what they all have in common is an inability to what all the epochs have in common is an inability to get beyond beings to being itself. Heidegger calls the thinking that remains immersed in beings metaphysics. Heidegger treats the events of the manifestation of beings, i.e., being itself, as a kind of brute fact. There's nothing behind this event bringing it about. Being, therefore, is a groundless ground, or as Heidegger likes to say, an Abgrund, an abyssal ground. Or just an abyss, right, if you take out the hyphen. Heidegger also claims that being is what it makes it the case that there is Dasein. I find this claim especially mysterious because it's absolutely unclear how Dasein, as a receiver or intender of manifestations, that is, Prüfer's dative of manifestation, could arise from manifestation itself. Granted, the manifestation triggers the intending of its intender, but the intender itself, as an intender, is not a manifestation. On what resources can being as manifestation draw to give us its intender qua intender? To use an analogy from optics, the action of the light on the eye presupposes the I and its capacity to be affected and triggers that capacity. It does not give us the I and its capacity. Here I think we reach the limits of Heidegger's phenomenological ontology. In a number of places in his work, both early and late, Heidegger suggests that there is a God, but this God is A, not a being, A, not being, B, not a being, C, not the ground of beings or beings, and D only enters the realm of being insofar as he or it is manifested to Dasein. This God is a göttlicher Gott because he is apparently, as Heidegger says in Identity and Difference, awe-inspiring, a divinity to whom we can pray and offer sacrifices, and before whom we can sing and dance. To use the language of Merold Westphal, Heidegger's God is, quote, religiously useful. In other words, this God can be treated as we would expect to treat a divinity. Notice that being and God, as Heidegger understands him, are both ultima in some sense. There is nothing beyond being that gives us being, and being itself is the origin of beings and Dasein. But God is independent and irreducible to being, since he is not a being, and so it would seem there is nothing that has power over God that could bring him about, unless Heidegger has forgotten to mention it. If I am right, then that being and the Heideggerian God are both ultima, neither could be the ultimum, and so we must think of them as being quasi-ultima or co-ultima. Now we come to ontotheology. What is it and what's the problem? On my reading, ontotheology is the double grounding of beings in what they have in common and in some highest being we call God, or that we at least treat like a divinity. Heidegger alleges that this is what Nietzsche does with the Wille zur Macht. The grounding of beings is what they have in common, what makes them beings. And this is the work of ontology. In some epochs of the Seinsgeschichte, what beings have in common manifests itself as physis, ancient Greece. In others, it manifests itself as createdness, medieval Christianity. In others, as objectness, modernity, etc. Heidegger calls what beings have in common the Seiendheit, or beingness. If beings are phenomena, then beingness is phenomenality. Besides the work of ontology, we try to ground beings in a highest divine being, functioning as some kind of cause, efficient or otherwise, and who is also his or its own ground, causa sui. This is a theological move. It turns out that nothing is without a ground, and it would seem that between beingness and the divine being, the latter is the ultimate ground, since it's what brings about all the other beings. Because metaphysics has always enacted this double grounding and combined ontology and theology in these senses, Heidegger says it has always had the essential figure of an ontotheology. So what's wrong with ontotheology? There seem to be four problems. First problem, ontotheology assumes that everything has a ground. But Heidegger would tell us that this isn't true, since both being and apparently God are groundless. Second problem, ontotheology is wrong about what ultimately grounds beings, i.e. phenomena. Their ultimate ground isn't some being, even a divine one. It's being as the event of their manifestation. Third problem, ontotheology is wrong about how beings are ultimately grounded. Beings aren't ultimately grounded in a cause, but by manifestation, which is being itself. And the fourth problem is that ontotheology presents us with a God who is religiously useless. Man can, quote, man can neither pray nor sacrifice to this God. Before the causa sui, man can neither fall to his knees in awe, nor can he play music and dance before this God, end quote. That then is the later Heidegger, his account of ontotheology, and his critique of it. So now I move on to the second part, part two, into the excess of esse. Now I want to turn to St. Thomas's ontology. Moving from Heidegger's ontology to Thomas's is virtually a quantum leap. We shall find ourselves completely at sea if we try to think Thomistic esse along the lines of Heideggerian Sein. To pass from Sein to esse is almost to enter another world. For Thomas, metaphysics is the scientia of ens in quantum est ens, which we could translate as a being insofar as it is a being. I put a in brackets there. What makes a being and ens a being, says Thomas, is that it has esse. Ens is id quod habet esse, or esse habens. Thomas's essay is translated into English in a variety of ways, as existence, active existence, being, active being, and so on. And in German, it's typically translated as sein. In this paper, I would prefer to leave it untranslated, because I am not happy with the available English possibilities, but also to distinguish it decisively from being in the Heideggerian sense. For similar reasons, I am also going to leave ens, plural ensia, untranslated. Because esse is at the heart of ens as ens, it is fair to say that esse is at the heart of Thomas's metaphysics and constituted as what I'm calling an existential ontology. That's a term that Gilson uses in Thomisme. Ontologie existentielle. I don't know if he invented that term, but that's where I'm getting it from. But how are we to understand esse? Ulrich shows us the way in this text from Homo Abyssus. This is a quote. Ipsum esse is the ultimate act, and since it is thus the actuality of all acts and the perfection of all perfections, it is the actuality of all things and even their forms. To being, nothing can be added other than non-being, quod non potest esse nec forma nec materia. Being, as the first effect of God, is in its infinite actuality the likeness of God, end quote. With these few words, Ulrich expresses all that is essential to Thomas's doctrine of esse. But of course, for people who are unfamiliar with this doctrine, this perfect summary will require explication. Ulrich rightly draws our attention to esse's nature as act, actus. This is precisely how Thomas understands it, and understands it as we see from the text which Ulrich quotes. To get a grip on esse, then, we need to have an understanding of the Thomistic doctrine of act, and that is what I shall turn to now. It might be helpful to begin by noting that Thomas contrasts act with potency, potentia. But potency is not simply the opposite of act. It is rather capacity for act. What does this mean? As a first stab at an explanation, let me propose an example. Consider Miles Davis. Before Miles learned to play the trumpet, he was no trumpet player. But once he did learn it, Miles became a fine trumpet player. Thomas would say that at T1, when Miles was not a trumpet player, he was a trumpeter in potency. He had the capacity to become a trumpet player. At T2, after Miles had become a trumpet player, Thomas would say that his potency to become a trumpet player was actualized. He has now become a trumpeter in act. Now consider Miles Davis himself, Miles the human being. Suppose we are living in a time T3 before Miles. At T3, Miles is a potency of the world. Or as we might also put it, Miles belongs to a possible world. But now suppose at T4 we are Miles' contemporaries. Miles is now in act. We could illustrate act and potency with other examples. We could analyze events, say, the Battle of Waterloo, in terms of act and potency. And we could do the same for the world as a whole. If something is neither an act nor a potency, there is no reason to think that it is something at all. On the contrary, it would necessarily be nothing, a pure zero. Here, once again, I'm going to have to do some extreme summarizing. What Miles is, his essence, is rational animal. His trumpeting, too, although it is accidental to him, also is a what, and so has an essence, namely trumpeting. Thus, Thomas speaks of substantial and accidental essences. If it belonged to Miles' essence that he should be an act, that is, if Miles were the kind of thing for which it would just be natural to be an act, then he would never have been in potency, for he would not be the kind of thing that could be in potency. There would never have been a time like T3 above when Miles was not around, but could be around. If it belonged to his essence to be an act, then Miles would just always already be around. Similarly, if it belonged to the essence of trumpet player to be an act, then presumably everybody would be a trumpet player, and there would be no non-trumpet players. In Thomas's metaphysics, esse is the name for the act that makes it the case that essences are actualized. Whatever does not have act by its essence, whatever has it contingently, like Miles in being a trumpet player, must receive esse from another to be an act. Without esse, then, nothing would be an act. There would be no Miles, no trumpet players, no world. Commenting on Summa Theologia Prima Pars, question 3, article 4, Domingo Bañez says that it is by esse that things are extra nihil, outside of nothing. And we can now see why this should be so. We should also understand now why Thomas says, as Ulrich tells us, that esse is the ultimate act and the actuality of all acts. Whatever is not nothing, whatever is an act in some way, is therefore id quod esse habet, and is, for that reason, called ens. Esse is what is magis intimum in an ens, innermost. Esse evidently relates to essence as act of potency. Essences can't make themselves to be an act. They require esse for that. There's the one exception of ipsum esse subsistens, but he doesn't make himself to be an act, he is act. If there are essences occurring in the world, then esse has already come on the scene. It already belongs to these essences, not by right, so Ulrich would put it, but as a gift. I'm sorry, not by right, but, so Ulrich would put it, as a gift, Gabe. Ensia are constituted by esse and essence. If they have their esse as a gift, then every ens is a gift as well. The giving of esse to ensia is the act of what Thomas calls creatio. Creatio can only be performed by reality that doesn't have its esse from another, and therefore must be ipsum esse subsistens. As such, this reality is esse purus. There could not be more than one ipsum esse subsistens, for if there were, they could only be distinguished if one were in some way not esse. But in that case, this other alleged ipsum esse subsistens would not be esse purus. Ipsum esse subsistens is God. As such, God has the power of himself to give ensia by giving esse, and doesn't need anything else to do this. Consequently, it would be completely arbitrary to posit a created subsisting esse from which God would draw to create ensia. A subsistent created esse thus falls victim to Occam's razor. Beyond that, however, we can say that any subsisting esse apart from God is simply an impossibility. As I just said, there can be no more than one ipsum esse subsistens. Created esse, then, is not a tertium quid between God and creatures, but something that inheres in created ensia. As Ulrich often points out, created esse is in itself a non subsistens. We've heard that plenty of times today. A non ens, a pure mediation, reine Vermittlung. It is in this context that Ulrich speaks of the ex initio and the transnihilation, Durchnichtung of esse. These terms name God's absolute gift of esse to ensia. There is nothing of esse that God holds back, and esse is never anything present in itself alongside God, as it were. Created esse might be regarded as a quasi-ground, but because it is non-subsistence, it is not an ultimate ground. Only God as ipsum esse subsistens could be this. Because he needs nothing outside himself to be what he is likewise a groundless ground, or abgrund. Furthermore, because there could be nothing else than God and the ensia he creates, he is the ultimum, and not a mere quasi-ultimum, like Sein or the Heideggerian God. Thomas thinks God gives esse as an efficient cause, but he's an efficient cause like no other, for no other efficient cause gives esse absolutely. I don't know that it's necessary to use the term efficient cause to describe God's agency in giving esse, but whatever term you use, it must be clear that esse ultimately comes from God and from him alone. The alternative would be to say that the esse of ensia comes from elsewhere, but that whatever this elsewhere is, it doesn't give esse. Since this is plainly contradictory, it's not a real alternative. Whether or not we want to say that God is an efficient cause, we must say that he is an essay giver, or that there is an essay giver, that is, a creator. It should now be clear to us that essay is predicated of creatures and of God in radically different ways. God is essay, and creatures have essay as a pure gift. The way that Thomas puts this is to say that God's essay is God's essence, and creatures only participate in essay. But God himself can't be the essay of creatures because he is the giver of their essay. Divine essay, which is radically outside created essay, is therefore very different from it. As Ulrich would tell us, using the language of the Fourth Lateran Council, there is a maior dissimilitudo between divine and created essay. Thus, Thomas holds that divine and created essay don't share a genus and are only like secundum aliqualem analogia. On the basis of this account of Thomas's existential ontology, I would contend that it can both include Heidegger's phenomenological ontology and exceed it. Let me explain. Sometimes things manifest themselves to me and sometimes they don't. Sometimes, for example, I'm seeing the ocean and sometimes I'm not seeing it, but something else instead. Maybe I'm seeing my wife or my children or a movie or a glass of scotch. All these things can and do manifest themselves to me. But if events of manifestation, what the later Heidegger calls Sein, can and do occur, then they are obviously characterized by act and potency. And if manifestation is a what, that is, has an essence, or is the action of something that has an essence, then it is in need of esse. That is, it is an ens of some sort. As such, it is a gift of ipsum esse subsistens. We saw earlier that Heidegger's phenomenological ontology can't account for Dasein, although Heidegger claims that it does, since he claims that being is the origin of Dasein. But manifestation doesn't evidently produce its dative, its recipient. Yet if Dasein has an essence and could be in act or not, in fact, Heidegger says that Dasein is mortal, then its esse, Daseins, is a gift of ipsum esse subsistens too. We can conclude that the gift of esse isn't only the gift of phenomenality, which is the only gift that being can give, if indeed being is a giver of gifts. Esse includes and exceeds phenomenality, and hence so does the giver of esse, ipsum esse subsistens. Okay, third and last part. Ontologies, 5 minutes? I can do it in 5 minutes, I hope. Ontologies ontotheologies A and B. In light of the foregoing, how might we relate Thomistic metaphysics to Heidegger's critique of ontotheology? As I said earlier, Heidegger's version of ontotheology is not quite the same as Ulrich's, and so I'm going to distinguish them by calling Heidegger's version of ontotheology A, and Ulrich's ontotheology B. Let's recall the 4 problems that, on my reading, Heidegger has with ontotheology A. 1, it assumes that everything has a ground, everything. 2, it's wrong about what ultimately grounds beings, that is, phenomena. 3, it's wrong about how beings, phenomena, are ultimately grounded. And 4, it presents us with a God who is religiously useless. What can we say about these problems and Thomistic metaphysics? Ad primum, Thomas is obviously not guilty of assuming that everything has a ground because he denies that God does. Ad secundum, he cannot be wrong about what ultimately grounds phenomena because, as we have seen, there could be no being, Sein, and no phenomena without ipsum esse subsistens. Ad tertium, he cannot be wrong about how phenomena are grounded because, like everything else, they can only be grounded by the giving of esse. Ad quartum, all we can say is that nothing but ipsum esse subsistens could be divine. Nothing could be above ipsum esse subsistens nor equal to it. If we do not treat it as divine, then that's our problem, not Thomas's. It's not the point of philosophy or theology to invent a golden calf that tickles our culturally relative religious fancy. So I don't believe that Heidegger's critique of ontotheology A has any force against Thomistic metaphysics. Let's move on then to ontotheology B. Heidegger in various texts spells out in detail precisely what he means by ontotheology, although he does this, as is typical, in ways that seem designed utterly to frustrate and confuse his readers. In Homo Abyssus, Ulrich's discussions of ontotheology are, by contrast, quite brief, but sufficient to give us a general idea of what he's driving at. For Ulrich, ontotheology might be described as a Maior dissimilitudo Vergessenheit, a forgetting of the Maior dissimilitudo between God and creatures. In ontotheology B, God becomes an ens alongside other ensia, even if he is thought as the supreme ens. He thus ceases to be the absolute ground of all ensia, who, as such, is always and must be the outside of the ordo creationis. Now, any thought that does not arrive at God as ipsum esse subsistens will necessarily be a figure of ontotheology B, which is to say that the history of philosophy and theology is littered with ontotheologies of this sort. Ulrich, then, has evidently opened our eyes to an important problem. Last paragraph. It would, of course, be academic at this point to say that Thomas is not guilty of ontotheology B, so I'm not going to say it. But I should say that what I have just said about God being the outside of the ordo creationis, to what I have just said about God being the outside of the ordo creationis, Ulrich would be anxious to add that God's way of being outside, that is, as ipsum esse subsistens, also makes it the case that creation is not outside him. Extra deum nihil est, since nothing can be without a gift of esse, or without the gift of esse, or his gift of esse. Extra deum nihil est. God is therefore vis-a-vis creatures, the wholly other, and, secundum quid, the non-other. And this divine alterity in non-alterity is yet another lesson that Ulrich has to teach us, but it is something that we will have to leave for another time. Thank you.